I'd like to call the meeting to order. Would everybody please rise? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Township of Old Bridge Zoning Board of Adjustment, February 6, 2020. Adequate notice of this meeting of the Old Bridge Township Zoning Board of Adjustment has been provided in accordance with the Open Public Meetings Act at least 48 hours prior to the commencement of this meeting by prominently posting in the municipal complex an announcement giving the time, the date, the location, and the agenda of this meeting. Also by mailing such announcement to the Home News and Tribune, and finally by filing a copy of such announcement with the municipal clerk. Ms. Silverman, can we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Dewhurst?
Here.
Ms. Chevalier?
Here.
Mr. Connor?
Here.
Ms. Kilda?
Here.
Mr. Gagnon?
Here.
Mr. Walker?
Here.
Chairman Sullivan? Here. Mr. Sachs?
Here.
Mrs. Shapiro? Here. Mr. Watt? Here. Mr. Gill?
Here.
Mr. Hart?
Here.
Mr. Garrity?
Here. Present. Welcome everyone here into the...
One more.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Lavallo?
Mr. Lavallo is here.
I didn't see you.
We welcome everybody into the meeting room this evening. Just as a matter of housekeeping, I'm sure everyone has a cell phone on. If you would please silence them so it doesn't interrupt not only the stenographer, but it's being recorded. And we're also televised on cable TV 15 here in Old Bridge, so we don't want to interrupt that as well. And while I'm speaking of that, I believe that it's run by interns from the high school, and as such, the TV must go off at 10 p.m. The meeting is scheduled till 10:30. The television, for those watching at home, will cut off at 10 p.m. as mandated. I'll try and give you a heads up if you're watching, if we happen to be going that late. But one way or the other, you will not see us past that hour. Moving forward, we're going to take a little out of order on your agenda if you're holding one. The last two applications will be flipped on the bottom of the page. That's the item number under item 8. They will flip. And other than that, we'll move, item number 3 is going to be held till after the meeting. That's a discussion. I'll call it in. Item 2 is the minutes, board members, as to January the 16th, 2020. Hopefully everyone has had time to read their copy of the minutes. Absent any suggestions for additions, deletions, I'd ask someone to move it for memorialization.
Motion.
I'll move them. Is there a second?
Second.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Dewhurst?
Yes.
Ms. Chevalier?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Kilda?
Yes.
Mr. Gagnon?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Chairman Sullivan?
Yes. Item number 3 is discussion, board members, and those of you here in the courtroom receiving for the annual report for 2019. We'll hold that discussion off to continue on with the other business this evening. We'll take it at the end of the meeting. Item 4 is escrow deficient resolutions. There's 2. We'll take each one. I'll take one vote on both, but I'll read them both in. 16-19Z is 220 LLC. 220 Gordon LLC in the amount of $2,500. That has been paid. The second one is 25-18Z. That's Dennis Korkowski. That's in the amount of $2,500. I'd ask someone to move those.
Motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Dewhurst?
Yes.
Ms. Chevalier?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Kilda?
Yes.
Gagnon?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Chairman Sullivan?
Yes. Under item 5 is continuance, 3619Z, Jersey 34 Associates. Mr. Klauser?
Hi, good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Peter Klauser with the firm Halber and Pape. We represent Jersey 34 Associates. At the end of last week, I had the opportunity to speak with Vina of your staff about her upcoming and Ms. Shapiro's report and comments that are coming out, and they think we'll have an opportunity to work with them to work through some of the comments and some of the technical stuff before we get in front of the board. So it seems that the best way to proceed is to ask if this matter could be adjourned. I would ask if the board could take jurisdiction. I understand that the 5th of March is available, so I would ask if it be adjourned without the requirement of notice or publication. We did notice and publish for this evening.
Mr. Sachs?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So that's certainly a reasonable request. So is there anybody here this evening on Jersey 34 Associates? Okay. All right, so if you're here this evening, the application is not going to be heard this evening. It's going to be carried to March 5th
Yes.
at 7:30 PM, and there'll be no further notice. So if there are people interested who were planning on attending tonight or are coming late, you can let them know that they will not receive any further notice, but it will be on for Thursday, March 5th at 7:30. Yes, same here, same place.
Same place. Anything else, Mr. Clausen?
We have another application that I filed, and I believe is on your agenda for April 2nd, which is Vision Stream. And I'm here to ask if the board would consider converting your C night, which I think is light or has nothing on it, on March 19th, to a special meeting. It is
Check with Ms. Silverman.
Yes, you had asked me earlier, I heard that you wanted a special meeting. I checked with our professionals, and I also checked with Ms. Strum, who's doing traffic, and she's clear for that night, so, and
We'll be meeting that evening. Does anyone on the board have an objection? All right, hearing none, we would be in favor of doing so.
I will publish a notice for that evening, and we'll be ready to proceed that night.
And Mr. Sachs, we do take jurisdiction, we recognize jurisdiction, right?
Well, actually,
I haven't published.
he hasn't done the
I will
publication.
publish for that
Okay.
night, and then we'll be on.
Yeah, and actually, as to Jersey 34, I know there was a request to accept jurisdiction. That can be accepted this evening. Yep, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Glaser.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
All right, again, that's 36-19Z. That matter will not be heard this evening. That matter will be on the calendar, March 5th, 2020. There will be no further notice, so please take note of that date. Item 6 is resolutions. We have one this evening, 28-19Z, Foglia Industrial Properties, LLC, amended resolution. Mr. Sachs?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is actually a resolution that had been adopted, I guess, back at the end of 2019. It was brought to my attention by the applicant's attorney that there was a typographical error in here. So what I did is I redid the resolution, and essentially, let me just read the paragraph that it now applies and is supplementing and amending the previous resolution. That would be in paragraph 7 on page 5, and I'll read it for the record. It says, Mr. Anthony Foglia, principal of the applicant, testified on behalf of the applicant. Mr. Foglia described the business operations of the applicant and noted that all operational loading occurs inside the existing building, and therefore an expanded and paid loading area is not necessary. Mr. Foglia also agreed to provide a new site plan indicating existing conditions and proposed that improved improvements for the review and approval of the professional staff. Finally, Mr. Foglia agreed that no additional paving would be necessary in the front of the building due to the applicant's operational activities. So that paragraph is now amending the previous paragraph 7 in the other resolution, and I believe that is it. All right, so...
That was the only change?
That was the only change, yep.
All right, board members, this is amended resolution as authored by Mr. Sachs, and he's explained the change to paragraph number 7. Someone want to move it, please?
Motion.
Is there a second? I'll second.
Okay.
Roll call, please. I did. Roll call, please.
Mr. Dewhurst?
Yes.
Ms. Chevalier?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Kilgo?
Yes.
Mr. Wagner?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Chairman Sullivan?
Yes. Item 7 on the agenda is interpretation. 5317Z, VNS Power LLC, Block 3231, Lot 9.12. Kenneth Pape, representing the applicant, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board, and board professionals. This is an application for an interpretation of a prior resolution adopted by the board. After discussing it with your professionals and your attorney, we have agreed that we'll amend the application to be an amended use variance and/or an interpretation, and we'll be prepared to present both of the proofs before the board. I'll amend the application, and we'll then have a publication obligation for the next hearing. We'll work with your staff to secure a hearing date. So this evening, we will not proceed. We'll amend the application.
Sachs?
Yeah, and that's, Mr. Chairman, that's acceptable. I did have a conversation with Mr. Pape earlier this evening and also with our professional staff, and certainly Mr. Pape would like to proceed in that fashion. It makes sense.
It works
So.
for us, too.
Board members, any questions? Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Pate.
you. Good night.
Have a good night. All right, that brings us to the last item for the agenda this evening. It's item number 8. There's 2 applications. They're going to be reversed, as I said. I'm going to call the first one tonight will be 16-19Z 220 Gordon LLC. This is in the R30 zone. It's 220 Gordon Road, 13 lots, 12 single-family homes, 1 basin, amended preliminary and final subdivision with amended D variance. Ron Shemanowitz, Esquire, representing. Sir?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Ron Shemanowitz here on behalf of the applicant 220 Gordon Road LLC. As the chair stated, we're actually seeking amended approval from the board tonight, both amended preliminary and final subdivision approval, as well as amended use variance approval for density and FAR, as well as bulk variances. This property is 3 tax lots. When we first came before this board back in 2014, there were 3 houses, 1 on each lot. Since that time, the houses have been raised, so now there are 3 vacant lots. As I stated, there were 3 prior approvals granted by this board. We bifurcated the application in 2014. The board granted a use variance for density and FAR to allow 14 lots, 13 building lots, and 1 detention basin lot. Thereafter, we came back in for preliminary approval and certain bulk variances, as well as design waivers, and the board granted that as well. The third approval was for final major subdivision approval and the C variances again. That resolution was adopted in May 19th, 2016. And all of that series of approvals all dealt with the 14-lot subdivision on Gordon Road. Since that time, we went to the outside agencies, and we were required to amend our plan to remove 1 lot line, eliminating 1 lot, bringing the entire subdivision down to 13 total lots, 12 of which are building lots. Everything else on the subdivision, you'll hear testimony tonight, is pretty much the same, other than the removal of that 1 lot line. So we've actually, in a sense, reduced the impact of the use variance, the density, as well as the FAR. The bulk variances are effectively the same. There was in the review letter a question raised about whether the bulk variances were formally granted along the way. For the avoidance of any doubt, we do have our planner here tonight who's going to provide some brief planning testimony just to affirm and reaffirm those variances, so there's no question about that. We think the resolution's very clear, but your planner did point out maybe a little discrepancy in the transcript, so we'd like to clear that up tonight. I do have 2 witnesses with me tonight, one being our site engineer, Walt Hopkins, and secondly, our planner, Nick Graviano. And we do have the review letters and are prepared to respond to those. Unless there's any other housekeeping, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to call my first witness.
Good answer.
Our first witness is Walt Hopkins, our site engineer.
Mr. Hopkins, please raise your right hand. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
All right, please state your name, spelling your last name, professional affiliation for the record.
Walter Hopkin, Hopkin. I'm the president of WJH Engineering.
And Walter, your qualifications for the board, please.
I'm a licensed professional engineer in the states of New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. I happen
Hopkins has appeared before this board many times. I did want him to put his credentials on only because we have a new member who's sitting, and I just want him to get used to hearing them, but we welcome him back. We accept his credentials.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Walter, just one overriding question. You heard me summarize all the approvals and the history of this. Have you been the site engineer primarily in charge of this project since day one? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Please proceed with sort of a little bit of background first to bring the board up to speed on where we've been, and then maybe you could describe what the change is.
Just real quickly to orient the board, it's a 9.5-acre site located on Gordon Road. It was formerly known as 220, 222, and 232 Gordon Road. It's block 3230, lots 2111, 2112, and 2114, and it is located in your R30 zone. It's surrounded by single-family residential with similar lot sizes, with the exception of Chesapeake Village, which is to the west, which is multifamily residential. As Mr. Shemanowitz indicated, previously there were 3 single-family homes with driveways out to Gordon Road. Since the application has progressed through the board and the application process, those homes have been removed. As Mr. Shemanowitz indicated, in 2016, we received final approval for 14 lots, 13 of which were buildable. 1 was a detention basin lot. We've met with your staff last week to kind of go through the history of the project because some were here and some had limited involvement with the previous approvals. We did receive DEP approval, which is what took us so long to get through the process. And as a result of that approval process, we lost 1 lot. So when you look at the board that's marked as A1 or the reduced-sized version, which is in front of you, and A1 is just a color-rendered version of the plans that was submitted to the board, you'll see that the detention basin kind of kicks out to a point that used to be a buildable lot. So other than that, the layout remains the same. The post-developed runoff meets the same reduction requirements. The landscaping is similar to, or almost identical to what it was before. There are no new variances, but the previous bulk variances are still required, and the planner will go into them a little bit more detail. There is no difference in the proposed building size, which relates to the FAR. So we would still need that, that variance as requested as 0.17. There was some confusion on our plans. It was our fault that your minimum non-critical area, your requirement is 65%. We have 1 lot that is above that and requires a variance. That was a variance that you previously granted. The confusion was we put 45% on our plan, and that was just simply a typographical error. The landscaping is very similar to what it was previously, with the exception of the detention basin landscaping. There were some questions in your planner's letter with regard to whether we needed some waivers. It's our opinion that we do not, and I can go through those in a minute and kind of explain why I don't think we do. And I do believe that we've complied with Mr. Lavala's request, and his letters indicated that as well. There was also some previous comments that weren't fully addressed, and one was a shade tree easement and the placement of the shade trees. We would revise those in accordance with your professional's requests. There was also a lot of discussion at the previous applications with regard to the emergency access drive. I have to apologize again to the board that that layer got turned off, so the plans submitted did not have that emergency access drive. That's a complete error and will be on all subsequent plans, and it is shown on the rendering this evening. I spoke to Mr. Garrity this evening as well, assured him of that, and also indicated that we would comply with any requirement that he had. I think specifically he wanted to make sure that the emergency access drive could withstand a 30-ton vehicle, and we will ensure that. There was also a discrepancy. We had 2 details for that on our plans, one that could substantiate the 30-ton and one that couldn't, and we'll remove the one that could not. There was also some comments with regard to lighting and additional lighting or additional analysis to comply with your ordinance, and we would do that analysis and add additional lighting if required. There was also a comment about sidewalks. The majority of the site is 5 feet. There was an area in the cul-de-sac that was reduced to 4 feet. We would increase that again to 5 feet. And there was also a comment with regard to lot 2145, and that's the only lot that actually fronts on Gordon Road and faces Gordon Road. Our front yard setback was dimensioned from the existing right-of-way and not the proposed. So we're going to amend that, push it back so that no variance is required for that. That's a very quick and brief discussion about what changes have been made. We did meet with your engineer and your planner, and I can tell you that I've gone through their letters and can comply with anything that I felt needed to be addressed I've just discussed. However, if there's anything specific that they need additional testimony on or the board would like, I'd be more than happy to.
Walter, just one quick record-keeping item. The exhibit that you've marked is Exhibit A1. Could you just give the title and date on that, just for the record, so we know what we've marked?
Yes, it's titled Major Subdivision of Block 3230, lots 2111, 2112, and 2114, prepared by WJH Engineering, and it's dated January 15th, 2020.
Thank you. Nothing further, Mr. Hopkins.
Is that a new exhibit?
Excuse me?
That's a new exhibit tonight?
Yes, that's
Yes.
been marked Exhibit A1.
Mr. Burek?
Mr. Chairman, just for the board's knowledge, I was here for the D variance application, but I wasn't here for the subsequent application that came before you. However, I did read all the transcripts. Actually, Ms. Sawant and myself have read all the transcripts, and have become very familiar with every phase of this project, and we have met with Mr. Hopkins and have gone over our review memo. With that said, in the engineering comments, I believe Mr. Hopkins, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, agreed to do everything. And I'm just going to pull out some of the items. There's item 3Y, which is not applicable anymore. There was one for information purposes only, and I just want to bring it to the board's attention. There is a lot, and you'll notice it is the second lot on the right on Christina Court, which has a lot of environmental constraints on it. There is a sales ordinance that we have in town that they would be required to comply with. So there is basically an environmental line that goes up basically parallel to that driveway, where it will limit any clearing or mowing or, any improvements beyond that line. And that's going to be delineated by the applicant by a split rail fence, and now we're requesting that a sign be posted so that the new owners would be aware of that. Our sales ordinance basically has some stipulations where at their closing, they'll be given a form, and that form says, do you have any, are you aware that there's easements on your property? Are you aware that there's a conservation easement? Are you aware that there's environmental constraints? And that alerts the home buyer that there are some things on their property that they cannot do. That is something that I thought was important for the board to realize, that on day one, once they move in, they'll know of those restrictions. Whether they understand it is a different scenario, but also there were 3 comments as far as contributions. One was sidewalk on comment 1M, and that was a sidewalk contribution because I believe the applicant engineer had made representation that there were environmental constraints along the frontage, and they didn't want to continue that sidewalk along, and I'm going to say it's pretty much the south side of Christina Court due to the environmental constraints. However, if the town wanted to do that, then therefore we would need to go get those permits and then construct that sidewalk. So there is a contribution amount, something a little bit less than $20,000, and people would say that's an expensive sidewalk, but because we have to go through that permitting process, that's how that tabulation comes in. I had requested from the engineer, and certainly this could be during the compliance phase, a construction cost estimate for the retaining wall. Typically what we do is, because it's a retaining wall within our right-of-way, and the applicant had made representation that they want us to accept Christina Court, that there be a cost estimate for that retaining wall so that we can come up with some sort of, upfront cost or fee that the applicant can post in escrow should there be some catastrophic failure in the future of that retaining wall. Lastly, we have in our ordinance, Chapter 250-78, a caveat which allows developers to transfer the ownership of the detention basin. I could tell you now that Vina has been working on removing that caveat in there so that in the future that wouldn't be available to a developer. It's been a long time coming for that. Our DPW staff can certainly maintain a detention basin where they're cutting grass or they're repairing a trash rack. But now with the stormwater management rules and the best management practice that DEP puts out, there are a lot of water quality chambers, filtration, systems that remove total suspended solids that would require us to get an outside firm to come and clean or maintain or change cartridges. We're not equipped to do that type of maintenance. That ordinance, the dollar amount in there, it doesn't contemplate any of these water quality chambers or these infiltration systems. On this project, we do have a detention basin, but at the end, we do have a water quality chamber. You know, that's something we would have to then farm out to somebody to come and maintain or change the cartridge. There's one comment in here, I think it was 3C, where the applicant has realized that because this project has gone on for quite a bit of time and they were in front of DEP for quite a bit of time, the water quality chamber that they were proposing is now not certified by DEP. So they're going to select a new one. Without that knowledge, I can't really come up with a dollar amount on what I would want them to submit today so we can continually maintain it over the next 30 years. With that said, a cost estimate would be submitted as well. Just for the record, my calculations show a contribution of something like $100,000 so that we're in a good situation on maintaining that basin, and that would be a contribution by the developer. That's something different than if you were to calculate it straight from what the ordinance says. But again, that ordinance doesn't contemplate any of these water quality chambers being in play. So I just wanted to put that in the record. I do want to say comment 1M is for the sidewalk contribution, comment 1K is for the maintenance of the wall contribution, and comment 3C is the basin contribution. And with that said, I believe when we sat in that meeting, we reviewed the entire memo, and Mr. Hopkins said that everything else was doable, except for the caveat that 3Y is not applicable.
You have any response, or, okay.
None needed.
Ms. Swan?
Thank you.
I'll hold off from commenting when the planner testifies.
Okay. Mr. Shemanowitz?
Next witness is our plan.
One second.
I'm sorry.
Board members on my left of this witness? On my right? Mr. Sachs?
Yeah, just one comment, just to follow up on Nicole. I think as well, I'd like to see some language in the individual lot deeds that are impacted by these conservation easements and these environmental constraints, that there be some language on those individual deeds as well, just as a further fail-safe. And Nicole, did you say 3Y? Because I don't, my report doesn't have a 3Y.
I'll give you the page number on it.
Oh, maybe, you know what,
Page 21 in the middle. Yeah.
I have it.
21 in the middle.
I have it. 21, okay, thanks.
That lot you're talking about up in the front on Gordon, is that whole home being moved slightly to accommodate the relief of that variance, as suggested?
Yes.
It
Yes,
is?
that was Venus' comment.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Your next witness, sir.
Next witness is our planner, Mr. Nick Graviano.
Thank you. Swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All right, please state your name, spelling your last name, professional affiliation for the record.
Yes, that's Nicholas with an H, Graviano, G-R-A, V as in Victor, I-A-N-O. I'm a partner and planner at Graviano and Gillis, Architects and Planners, with a business address of 101 Crawford's Corner Road in Holmdel, New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Graviano. Again, I wanted that for the newer member of our board to just hear credentials. The board is familiar with you. You've testified here just recently, as a matter of fact. We accept his credentials.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you. This is an amended application on the variances, but we do want to get on the record since it has been some time and there was a question in the transcript. So if you can give the abridged version of the justification for the variances.
I certainly will. The applicant is before you this evening for amended preliminary and final major subdivision approval with associated bulk variances. This is related to a specific piece of property, otherwise known as Block 3230, lots 21.11, 21.12, and 21.14. The applicant's proposal does include reducing the number of residential building lots from 13 to 12. There will be one basin lot that is included with the proposal. The site zoning has not changed since the previous application, nor has the character of the area. The applicant, with respect to the previously granted D variances, the applicant was granted a floor area ratio of .17. The applicant is now proposing .16, so that's a reduction. Additionally, with the reduction of a lot, the applicant has also reduced the requested density variances. So with respect to the D variances that were previously granted, they were not augmented by this application, so they continue to be valid and do not have to be requested again. The applicant is requesting the C variances due to the reconfiguration of the site. The applicant does require a variance for minimum lot area where 30,000 square feet is required and 20,000 square feet is proposed. The applicant is additionally requesting a rear yard setback variance where 75 feet is required and 50 feet is proposed on all lots except for proposed lot 21.44, which was granted a smaller setback variance. Additionally, the applicant is requesting a variance for the minimum non-critical area that was discussed previously. 65% is required, whereas 51.6 is proposed. Additionally, the numbers of stories is requested, 2.5 is permitted, and 3 is proposed. I think with respect to all of those variances, all of them, aside from the minimum non-critical area variance, can be granted under the C2 criteria. It does help promote the public interest with the public health, safety, and general welfare, while creating a subdivision that's in harmony with the surrounding neighborhood. Additionally, it helps provide for a variety of residential uses in appropriate locations. That's purpose G of the MLUL. And lastly, it helps advance a desirable visual environment through good civic design and arrangement. And with respect to the non-critical area variance that's requested, that is justified under the C1 criteria due to the exceptional environmental conditions that are facing the site. All these variances are not a substantial impairment to the zone plan or zone ordinance and could be granted in good conscience by this board.
Thank you, Nick.
Mr. Walker.
I don't have any questions for Mr. Graviano. I just wanted to let the board know that I did talk to Mr. Graviano and I had asked him, and in fact Mr. Shimanowitz too, when we were reviewing all the transcripts, because I wasn't there when the original application was reviewed, so I went through every meeting, and what I discovered is when the use variance was granted, there was discussion that the C variances will be discussed at the preliminary and the final stage. When the application came in for preliminary and final, there was a lot of discussion about variances. There were originally, I think there was a variance for even the building height, which was then eliminated. However, the board did not vote on those C variances. So I thought it was a good idea that the planner comes in, testifies, re-records all the variances that are required, and the board has the opportunity to then vote on those.
Thank you. Ms. Shapiro, anything for the planner? Board members on my left? On my right. Mr. Garrity, did you have anything at this point?
The only thing I'd like on the record is that the fire access road is going to go to the blacktop on the Cheesequake Delaware Court in Cheesequake Village. And that it is
What's that going to be controlled by, a chain and
it's going to be chain
Knox
color
lock?
posts on both sides of the fence. I believe they had a fence that they're going to put in also.
Okay.
Walter, no objection to those requirements? Those are fine, Mr. Chairman.
Anything else?
Everything else is fine on the plan.
Thank you, Fire Marshal. Mr. Lavallo, anything, your name was mentioned, I thought maybe we'd give you a chance to weigh in?
No, with the 5 or 6 reports I had done, the project did comply with the final report.
Thank you. Mr. Sachs, anything?
No, you know what, Mr. Graviano, just so the record is clear, so the D4 under the previous application was what percentage?
It was .17.
Okay, and now it's?
.16.
How about the D5?
The D5, I'll have to get the count for you.
But obviously, that's been decreased as well.
Yeah, because there's been one lot less. The density calculation is now 1.257, whereas 1.2 is required by ordinance. So it's just a tad above what the code requires.
Thank you.
You have any other witnesses?
We do not, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead,
Fire
Mr.
Marshal. I have a question for the Fire Marshal. Tom, on the opposite side where that emergency access road ends in Cheesequake Village, is that going to be striped off?
Yes, it will.
Okay. Thank you.
I did contact them, they were aware and agreed to this. Both parties have been very receptive to it, actually.
Anything else?
That's it.
I think most of the board members sat for this.
Mr.
Some did
Chairman.
not, but most of us did, so, oh. Go
I'm
ahead,
sorry.
Mr. Watt.
Can we have the planner state the floor area ratio variance and the density variance again?
Sure. Would you please? Mr.
Well, I had, the D4 was .1, the old D4 was .17, now it's being reduced to .16.
Correct.
And the D5, the existing now is 1.257?
Correct.
Okay.
I thought it was, the originally approved was .13, and now it is .136.
Talking about for the
The
D5?
previously,
Yeah, D5. That's what it is on here.
Yeah.
I'm going on the calculations in the review letter dated January 15th, 2020, whereas the floor area ratio that's permitted is .14, proposed is .16, and .17 was granted previously.
you're correct. I'm sorry.
You didn't really think you made a mistake yourself, did you?
You're looking at the wrong page.
All right, so as I say, the only obvious change to this, if this was on February 2nd of this application, instead of tonight, I'd say it's Groundhog Day. Because it seems all too familiar. The only change, of course, as mentioned, was the loss of one unit because of the detention basin, which is in the upper left-hand corner, as you can all see on the exhibit. So there was the big change there, and I guess some subtle changes with moving of the house and the front lot slightly over. Anything else you want to tell the board, Mr. Sachs, before this is going to require, obviously, a D4 and a D5 in bulk variances, correct?
Yeah,
Still.
yes.
I'm going to go to public portion next.
But yeah, we'll vote on so we tie up all the loose ends.
Yeah,
So there's
this
no
time.
confusion.
Yeah.
We'll vote on the amended D4, the amended D5, the bulk variances, which we now have testimony on, and then preliminary, and then the final subdivision. Preliminary and final, amended preliminary and final.
All right, first we'll open this up to the public. This is matter 16-19Z. It's 220 LLC, located at 220 Gordon Road. Anyone here in the courtroom this evening who wants to be heard on this matter, please raise your hand. No one has. I'll close the public portion. All right, moving forward, board, then, as Mr. Sachs has indicated, these be amended votes, correct?
Well,
It's an amended application.
it's an amended application.
So it's really new votes.
It's new votes for the D4. Let's do the D4 first.
Okay, so it would be D4 for floor area ratio first, followed by D5 for maximum dwelling units.
Motion, Walker.
Motion for D4 by Mr. Walker, is there a second?
I'll second.
Connor seconds, roll call, please.
Mr. Dewhurst?
Yes.
Ms. Chevalier?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes?
Mr. Kilgore?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Chairman Sullivan?
Yes. And as to D5, that's for maximum dwelling units per
Yes.
gross acre, right?
Yep.
Someone want to move the D5?
I'll move it.
Is there a second?
Second.
And second, roll call, please.
Mr. Dewhurst?
Yes.
Ms. Chevalier?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Kilgore?
Yes.
Gardner? Yes. Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Chairman Sullivan?
Yes.
Bulk variances.
Do we want to enumerate the bulk variances, or as?
As referenced by Mr. Graviano,
Okay.
it's fine.
Board members, bulk variances as represented. Someone want to move them?
I'll move it.
Second.
Second, Mr. Walker. Roll call, please.
Mr. Dewhurst?
Yes.
Ms. Chevalier?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Kilgore?
Yes.
Gardner? Yes. Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Chairman Sullivan?
Yes. Should we do preliminary first and then final?
Yep.
All right, preliminary major site plan. I'll move it.
Subdivision.
Subdivision. I'll move it.
Chairman,
Yes.
there's one waiver.
Ooh. The waiver is, what am I missing?
The waiver from section 250-74C1. Basically, it's just a technical waiver. It is, no landscaping is proposed on lot 21.42, 21.44, and 21.45, where landscaping is required on lots, so it's just a technical waiver.
Objection?
I would just state, we do have a typical foundation planting that includes ornamental trees on our landscaping plan for every lot. So there is landscaping on every lot. It's not shown on the rendering, but on the landscape plan, there's a typical, it's been on there a while, a typical landscape plan that has over 20 shrubs and I think 2 ornamental, maybe 30 shrubs and 2 ornamental trees. It's on the landscape and lighting plan, which is page 7, and right above the revision block, there's a typical foundation planting detail. And that's intended to be on every lot. We can make sure that that's clarified on subsequent plans.
No need for the waiver.
That's fine.
All right, then we'll go preliminary
Right.
subdivision, right?
Yep.
I'll move it. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved in second. Roll call, please.
Mr. Stewart?
Yes.
Ms. Chevalier?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Gilbo?
Yes.
Gardner? Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Chairman Sullivan?
Yes. Final major site plan?
Yep. Subdivision.
Final major subdivision.
I'll move it.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved in second. Roll call.
Mr. Stewart?
Yes.
Ms. Chevalier?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Gilbo?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Chairman Sullivan?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shemanowitz, and your professionals.
Take a 5-minute break for Debbie. Debbie needs a break.
Board, we're going to stand in recess for 5 minutes. I'd like to call the meeting back to order. Ms. Silverman, could we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Dewhurst?
Here.
Ms. Chevalier? Here. Mr. Connor?
Here.
Ms. Gilbo?
Yeah, here.
Gardner? Here. Mr. Walker?
Here.
Mr. Psychowski? Here. Mr. Stoner?
Present.
Chairman Sullivan?
Here.
Mr. Sachs?
Here.
Mr. Wong? Mr. Hart? Mr. Garrity? Mr. Lavala? Here. Mr. Darjik?
Present.
Okay, we have a final application for the evening. I'd like to read it into the record. It's 15-19Z Metro Storage LLC. This is located in the OG1 zone at Route 9 and Cindy Street for a 3-story self-storage facility. It's requesting preliminary and final major site plan, C and D variances. John Wicascala representing the applicant. Sir.
Good evening, Chairman, board members. John Wicascala on behalf of Metro Storage. It's my pleasure to be back this evening. This is the 5th public hearing with respect to this application. Since we were here last, we did make an amended site plan submittal with respect to the project. And, just the highlights in that regard. We have scaled back the size and scope of the project. We eliminated what had been the one-story structure along the rear portion of the property. It had been proposed within that required 50-foot buffer area to the residential homes to the rear. So the application has been amended to eliminate that. The result of that modification has been the elimination of the variance relief in that regard regarding that buffer area, reduction in FAR. We have eliminated all sign variances associated with the application as had originally been requested. We are proposing only one building-mounted sign. We stipulated to that previously, but I do want to state it for the record because your planner appropriately noted we had submitted some revised architectural plans. Purpose of that revision was we also reduced the height of the building to approximately 32.9 feet. We still have a height variance, but it is a C variance rather than a D variance. But with that architectural plan revision, we missed removing that one additional wall sign, although it is shown only as one wall sign on the site plans themselves. So I have two witnesses that I intend to call this evening. Brad Bowler, he is our project engineer. Mr. Bowler is going to run through the plan revisions for the board, some of the comments from the board professionals. We also received a Shade Tree Commission letter. And I'm also going to have Mr. Bowler elaborate again on the stormwater management system and design. He provided detailed testimony in that regard at the first public hearing, although a number of our neighbors have raised comments and concerns in that regard. So we're going to go back through that, and I know many of them were not here at that first hearing. So besides Mr. Bowler, I also have Bob Heilman with Metro. Mr. Heilman is going to come up for some brief testimony relative to their standard form of lease agreement, because there were some comments previously about operations and so forth, and as well as some just, real experience relative to traffic generation, what they experience at another facility and in general. So those are the witnesses. I do have my traffic engineer and my planner here as well. I don't anticipate calling or intend to call them unless, well, there's some reason to along the way.
Thank you. Could you just move the mic away a little?
Yeah.
Get a little feedback.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go right ahead, sir.
And Mr. Bowler, you're still under oath. You've been sworn in
Confirmed.
previously. Yep, thank you.
So we have two additional exhibits tonight. The first exhibit up is going to be marked A9. I believe we marked the last time we were here, marked two exhibits, so this will be A9.
Did we mark, I don't know.
We marked one exhibit because of the fact that we were showing it to explain.
Okay.
So
Yep.
This is
Sure.
A9.
Perfect.
So this is the overall exhibit. It's rendered site plan with the landscaping on it, showing the overall tract, just for reference purposes for the board. The next exhibit will be A10, and that's the zoomed-in version. That's the site plan sheet, again, rendered with the landscaping on it, and that will be the exhibit we'll testify to tonight. So to summarize the changes, Mr. Wichiscalo mentioned a number of them, but to go through them, there was an single-story outbuilding, an accessory building on the east side of the property. That's to the bottom of the page. That's been removed at 7,000 square feet approximately. Reduced the FAR down to 0.28, where 0.25 is required. It also reduced the impervious coverage by the 7,000 square feet approximately in that area. As part of the changes in that area, we did regrade the property to provide a more defined grading in that area and direct all the stormwater from that portion of the property onto our site, into our drainage system. As part of that design, the drainage that goes to the neighboring properties, I testified this at the first hearing, there's approximately 1,000 square foot area that goes to the south, which is the funeral home that will go, that currently goes there. It's a reduction of about half, so about 2,000 square feet under existing conditions, reduced to 1,000 square feet, again, to the funeral home to the south. And then there's about a 5 or 10 foot wide swath, about 20 feet wide, that currently drains to the east. That will remain. We aren't touching that area. We're going to leave the trees the way they are in the existing conditions in that location from a grading perspective. In addition, we added additional trees, shrubs, grasses. A total of 282 trees, shrubs, and grasses were added to that area to enhance the buffer. So as of right now, it's a 50-foot buffer with a minimum of 3 rows of evergreen trees, if not 4 or 5 rows in those locations now at this point. So instead of a building, we do have evergreen trees in those locations, as well as grasses and shrubs. From a building perspective, we did reduce the height of the building to 32.9 feet from average grade facing Route 9. So that's the ordinance criteria at that point. So now we are under the requirement for a D variance. We still have a variance for the height, but we're less high in that situation as well. We did remove the one sign on the building, so now we have one building mounted sign. With regards to the freestanding sign, we removed the digital board, so that's no longer a variance for our application. And because we removed the board, the area of the freestanding sign is not compliant with the code in that situation, which is less than 50 square feet. With regards to stormwater, We maintain the basin as designed, even though we went from building, which is impervious coverage, to landscape area. So the basin's slightly oversized from the previous conditions. As part of our design, the way the stormwater basin does operate is it takes the water that's being generated by the runoff by the impervious coverage and holds it in an underground storage system like a bathtub would. So it fills up with water over time and then discharges slowly out into the stream. So as DEP criteria requires, we're required to reduce the flow for the 2-year storm, the 10-year storm, and the 100-year storm. So 100-year storm, something like Sandy or Irene, when the water comes through, it's a lot of rainfall event at one time. Most of the general storms we see in these areas are 2 or 10-year storm events where it's a couple inches of rain, maybe those microbursts, and that's what you typically see on a normal basis throughout the system. When we run through the stormwater analysis and we review the stream that's coming through the property, what happens is the stream actually fills up that area to the north of our property first, and then our detention basin holds back the water during the storm events and discharges it very slowly. So typically what happens is our peak flow gets offset from that storm. So when you have a discharge out of the basin into the stream, there's water going to that area, but it's after the main storm event comes through. So there's an offset there. So there's going to be water still going to the system in accordance with the design, but it meets DEP criteria. And there's an offset now, so there's essentially the same amount of water because of the river in that area, but there's no impact to the actual elevation of water that's going to the stream. I believe that's it with regards to the changes and the addressing of the items. I did review the review letters. I think I hit the last open item on the ERI letter, which was the off-site flow. I mentioned that in the first hearing, but I wanted to reiterate that as well. And then with the planning letter, I don't have any further comments with regards to that. The final letter we got, I think it was on Monday, was the Forster Letter. There are 2 comments in here that we can agree with, but we wanted to explain. So with regards to the letter, we can address everything with the exception of on page 5E. There was a request to add understory shrubs in the buffer area to the east of the building between the residential property and our drive lane. We can certainly do that. It may require that we remove some trees. So we're hoping to keep the trees as opposed to the shrubs, but we'll work with the forester on what's appropriate for this area. We have no problem doing either. It's fine. And then item G, which is a request for a berm. We can do the berm on the southeast portion of the property, the first 2 houses on our property, 6 feet high. That's not a problem from a grading perspective. The grade does fall away from the property going northbound, so the next 2 houses near our development area, we wouldn't be able to achieve the berm just because of a grading situation in that area. So we would be able to do it for a portion of the property. The board requests that. That's not a problem. We can certainly make that happen. And that would be it. We can.
Why don't we see if Mr. Lavallo wants to comment? Mr. Lavallo, any comment?
Yeah, the intent of that berm was to add the composition of the trees and shrubs that are on there now are basically 6 to 7 foot. You're going to install them. You're removing the overstory trees. The intent is to maximize the buffer as soon as or immediately as possible. Taking down tall trees. Right now, in the deciduous trees, you can see right through there. You can probably, residents can probably see right through the highway. So replacing with evergreens is an improvement. However, when you take the tall 60, 70-foot trees down and you have 6 or 7 foot shrubs, you're not getting immediate buffering. So we wanted to try to add that by adding a berm there. And know that in the northeast corner there, it's a 15-foot slope, and it's a very steep slope. And one of my comments is, how are you going to stabilize that slope with the plantings? Because it is very steep in there. So I wanted to try to, and especially toward the back of the residential properties, and attempt to leave some of the taller trees there that would help establish the smaller understory plants. And in terms of the understory plants, when you have white pines that are scheduled in there, and white pines after 10 or 15 years, they lose their lower branches and they put their growth toward the top, so you have no buffering from those plants. And that's why I offered some suggestions on other plants. So when the evergreens grow up and they lose the lower branches, you want to have some coverage underneath there, so you have a fully year-round in perpetuity buffer.
Sure. So there's no problem taking care of that.
Anything else?
There's quite a bit in the report.
Okay, but just those two items that he was speaking about for now.
Okay,
The rest of the report, we can agree to comply with.
okay.
All right?
Yeah.
Counsel?
Thank you. Nothing further. I'd like to call.
Go to Mr. Want or Mr. Dargy, who wants to go?
I don't have it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is our fifth hearing, so all the items in our letter have, at this point, pretty much been satisfied. There's a few detail items which we can address. Should the board, act favorably on the application, I'm comfortable we can address those items. But I do have a couple of questions for Mr. Bowler, really more just for clarification. I like to speak in terms of existing and proposed. So in the existing undeveloped condition, can you just describe to the board where the water flows, and then eventually it gets down to the water course? Which way does that water course go?
The water course goes from east to west, so to the top of the page into the Route 9.
So it's flowing in under Route 9?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? Okay. And in the proposed condition, so I'm sorry, just staying with the existing condition, I think I heard you say that it may be a little constricted getting under Route 9, so it does get, it gets detained there in that green area? Is that what we're saying?
Under the larger storms, it does back up because the
It
pipe's
backs up,
not
gets
large enough
detained.
for that.
And then eventually it drains under Route 9?
Yes.
Okay, so in the proposed condition now, obviously the flow is going to stay the same. The discharge, you're discharging your system to that stream, and that stream goes under Route 9 eventually. But under large storms, we're saying that that may back up, but your stormwater system is designed such that it will detain your runoff from your site, such that it will actually discharge after the storm passes. Is that what we're saying?
That's correct. And in addition to doing that, from a conservative perspective, we modeled our stormwater basin to account for a backup of the water just in case that happens. But when we look at the discharge points, they do offset enough where there's not going to be an interaction between the stream flow and the discharge of the basin.
Okay, so given in the existing condition, the site basically runs right to the stream and has a certain peak rate. In the proposed condition, you're actually reducing the peak rate and you're delaying that peak rate, so it's offset. Is that what we're saying?
That's correct.
Okay. I just wanted to get that clarification, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Anything else at this time?
I have nothing else.
Ms. Swan?
I have no questions.
Sachs?
No.
Board members on my left, this witness. And on my right. How are we going to go?
Well, I'm going to let Mr. Wissaskala put his entire case on.
Okay.
And then Mr. Gazarovski will have an opportunity to cross-examine whatever witnesses he
He'll be
sees.
subject to recall.
Correct.
Yes. Thank you.
Going anywhere.
We're not, he's not.
Can I just get a clarification as to the title and qualifications of the witness who just testified? He was the engineer who did...
He was the engineer who had been qualified, I think, at the first hearing, Mr. Gazarovski. Yep, okay.
So this is, I'd like to call Bob Heilman, who's seated next to me. I'll remind Mr. Heilman, he was previously sworn, and you're still under oath.
For the new member, please just say what he's...
Yeah, Bob, why don't you just explain your
testifying
position and role.
We have a new member on the board.
Sure. Bob Heilman, I'm our Metro Storage's Vice President of Development. Also a licensed architect in Illinois and Wisconsin.
You're testifying as
Metro Storage.
Correct.
Thank you.
Correct.
Go
So, Mr. Heilman, we submitted actually a couple of documents with respect to this. One of the documents submitted is the Metro Standard Form of Rental Agreement. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if you could please just provide, because there were questions about business operations out of these facilities, we articulated prohibitions and so forth in this regard. If you could just highlight for the board, the general restrictions, prohibitions, and how that operation runs.
Sure. So this is our standard, it's coming up on the screen, our standard rental agreement for the state of New Jersey. I'll just hit some of the highlights before it comes up. Section 3 of the lease, use of self-storage space. Leasee, I'll just hit some of the highlighted points that you'll see. Leasee agrees not to store any explosives or any highly flammable goods or any other goods in the space which would cause danger to the space. Leasee agrees that the property will not be used for any unlawful purpose. Further on in that section, there shall be no habitable occupancy of the space by humans or pets of any kind. That's grounds for termination. The leasing shall indemnify, skip down, leasing agrees not to conduct any business out of the space, further agrees that the space is not to be used for any type of workshop, any type of repairs, or for any sales, renovations, decoration, painting, or other contracting. One other area, regulated material, no persons renting a storage space at this facility shall store guns, ammunition, alcohol, or any regulated material which includes but is not limited to corrosive liquids, flammable, compressed gas, hazardous chemicals, highly toxic material, oxidizing materials, potentially explosive chemicals, or radioactive and flammable liquids. Lessee understands and agrees not to store any prohibited items in the storage space. Any person who violates may be subject to a fine. Those were the points I wanted to highlight. It's really just a 5-page lease, but those are highlights that were, at some point, concern was brought up about what could be stored. Obviously, our personnel are on site during the majority of the time that people move material in and witness what is moved in. And we also obviously do twice-a-day checks on the entire facility. If we smell anything, hear anything, it is immediately reported, so.
And Mr. Heilman, we've had a fair amount of traffic testimony in this regard. Our traffic engineer, John Harder, testified at a prior hearing, also submitted a traffic impact statement that essentially concluded, in terms of trips to and from a facility here, the ITE, the Institution of Transportation Engineers manual, basically determined, according to Mr. Harder's report, that, typical weekday morning during the peak hour, we're looking at roughly 13 trips, 8 cars in, 5 cars out in that peak hour. During the evening weekday peak, Monday to Friday, there'd be an expectation of 23 trips pursuant to the ITE manual. And then on the weekend, there's a trip peak of 41 trips, that's 24 cars, 17 out. I'd like you to talk a little bit about, that's what the ITE projections are, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about real life and your operations and the type of trip generation. And correct me if I'm wrong, but your experience in this regard is that actual trip generations and visits to these sites are generally lower than the ITE. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. That's what we found. I took the initiative to look at probably our most comparable store, which happens to be in Springfield, New Jersey, at 22 U.S. Route 22 West. It's a right-in, right-out, similar to this proposed project. It's a facility that has 82,000, roughly 500 square feet of rentable footage. The proposal we have here is slightly bigger at 86,600 rentable square footage.
It's rentable, not gross.
Rentable. What I did is I took a look. Obviously, we have a proprietary PIN for every customer that comes into the building. So everything is regulated. We can monitor exactly when people come in the facility. So I took a look at a week in December, December 9th of 2019 through December 15th. So a Monday through a Sunday. Use the gate codes or the PIN codes to look, and we have that data. It's 80 pages of data on from the system. Basically, during the week, so our busiest day was a Sunday of that week. The weekdays, Monday through Friday, we have trips for the, this is full days, and I can go down to the averages, but full day trips, Monday through Friday, 52 for Monday, 76 for Tuesday, 62 for Wednesday, Thursday 60, and Friday 66.
I'm going to object to this testimony because basically this is hearsay testimony. He didn't perform those counts. He didn't give up.
Well, first of all, Mr. Gazarovski, you can certainly cross-examine him. This is not a court of law where I'm going to rule on what's considered hearsay. So certainly you can question him on this, and I believe he did testify that he did participate in these counts.
Right, these are directly from our operating system from these dates from that facility.
Explain what that document is, and it was a submitted document that went into the board. If you could just explain the background, how that works, and how you can account for the number of customers coming and going.
We have obviously a control system for the building. Anything, any door access that you plug in your PIN number that you get when you sign your lease, we monitor every movement into the building. So we have a system that controls that PIN pad and goes to a controller and obviously the brain and computer for that system. This is what this data comes from. So we are able to pick out any day, any time during the week, month, year that we want to look at to see who was in the building. Obviously, you do that for any liability reason that is out there, but we also like to use it for marketing to understand who's using our facility and when. Okay. So this is the week, like I said, December 9th through December 15th of 2019, and it's every action that the system made for that week. Again, it's 80-some pages because a lot of stuff happens other than people coming to the facility. The system actually does a lot of regeneration overnight and resetting. The system also sends out letters. It does a lot more than just monitor people there. So it does a lot of different actions. Right. But in a sense, I pulled the data of the activity for people punching their numbers in to get into the location, which basically tells me customer visits. Trips, obviously, customer is one person punching in. So that person comes to the facility and leaves the facility. So trips are actually 2 times what the customers are. I know what the customers are from here. I times it by 2, and that generates my trips. So these are actual people that come and go from the facility. Average trip during the week, Monday was 3.5 people per hour, or trips per hour, excuse me. Tuesday, 5 trips per hour. Wednesday, 4 trips per hour. Thursday, 4 trips per hour. Friday, 4 trips per hour, 4.4. Saturday, 4.4 trips per hour. Sunday, 6 trips per hour is the average. Sunday being the busiest day, I took and I actually broke out all of Sunday hour by hour. So the busiest hour on Sunday was 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. We had 6 customers, which equaled 12 trips. That was the busiest point of the entire week. And this is a fully occupied, economically and physically occupied building. It's been operating for now about 3 to 4 years, I think it's 4 years. And it's fully leased out. On Route 22, which I'm sure you guys have been into the shopping district of Route 22, it's extremely busy. And this is the actual trip generation for that week and that time.
Mr. Hammond, so is this a record that's kept in the ordinary course of business?
Yes.
And this is a record that's kept in the ordinary course of business for all your facilities throughout the United States?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Mr. Gazarovski?
And my only comment, we actually it is a redacted document, because there was actually a final that had customer names and so forth, and that was...
Right, I cut off other names.
All right, fine.
But we have unit numbers, so
all right.
It's actual unit.
I mean, certainly it is not, it certainly, in my opinion, under the New Jersey Rules of Evidence, which are not binding in this forum. However, if Mr. Gazarovski, you'd like to make an objection that it's hearsay, I would suggest that this falls under the exception to the hearsay rule under the business record exception. And certainly, if you would like to review that document or cross-examine Mr. Hallman as to that document, I'll give you that liberty.
Cross-examine him at a later date or later?
No, when
it's your turn.
When it's your turn, when you put your when you continue with your objector's case. Okay, thank you.
Nothing further.
Mr. Dargy, any questions?
I have nothing from
Ms. Sawant?
I have nothing.
All right, board members on my left or on my right? Is this a normal type of operation? This is, to your knowledge, is this about basically what would happen? I'm familiar with the corridor you're talking about and the unit. I lived in that area. It's a very busy.
Correct. It's just comparable. I wanted to get something comparable to the location. I mean, the location here, we have a signalized intersection. On 22 at that location, there's no signalized intersection. So, but as far as size of the building, operation of the building, in essence, it's the same type of facility.
One would guess that Sundays is probably the busiest day when most people
Saturday,
are
Sunday, depending on the
moving.
week.
Saturday or Sunday.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nothing further, Chairman.
No other witnesses?
No other witnesses at this time.
Want Mr. Gazarovski to You can cross
Certainly.
here first and go backwards? I don't know, which way do you want to do? As long as the man's here, you want to talk to him now? You want to cross-examine him? You can do it any way you want, I don't care.
The applicant has concluded his case, is that correct?
Yeah.
Appears so, yes.
Fine. I'd like to call back the first witness, if I may.
Sure. Mr. Bowler, come on back up.
You can share, right? Oops, oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I could have done that, Kim. Sitting there eating a cookie.
A cookie.
All set? Mr. Gazarovski, go right ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Bowler, good evening. Mr. Bowler, you were present at the last hearing, were you not?
Yes.
And you listened to the testimony given at that time, as well as testimony, I believe, at one or two previous hearings.
I don't believe there was testimony given at the last hearing, but the previous hearings, yes.
Okay. And you prepared the plans with relation to the application in question, and I take it you prepared the list of variances which were sought as they were applicable to the initial application that contained two buildings.
We prepared the plans and we worked with the team and the temperature professionals for the list of variances, yes.
And is it not true that of the 10 variances you sought at that time, you are still seeking 6 variances, including a use variance? I want to refer you to the letter of Environmental Resolutions, Inc., which is dated February the 4th of 2010.
I'm sorry, I didn't count the variances, but the variances that are identified in the review letters are accurate with our plans.
Pardon me?
The variances that are indicated in the review letters are accurate with our plans.
So rather than seeking 10 variances, you are now seeking 6 variances, including a use variance.
Yes.
Now, do you recall at the end of the hearing last time, I was a little agitated because we had gone through the entire hearing, and at the very end, Mr. Wichaskala produced a new plan saying, well, we're now reducing it to one building. And one of the things I wanted to ensure is that, number one, we came back for this hearing, but secondly, with regard to this hearing, that all of the work that needed to be done to be reviewed could be completed 10 days prior to this hearing. Do you recall those conversations?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in looking at the letter, which I just referred to, on page 5 of 6,
Page 5. Which page are you referring to?
Which report, Mr. Gazarovski?
Report?
I'm sorry?
It's comment 17 on.
Report of Environmental Resolutions, Inc., dated February the 4th of 2020. Do you have that letter?
I do.
Did you review it prior to coming here?
I did. If you're referring to comment 17, which was the open comment in this letter, I provided testimony at the first hearing to address this item, and I reiterated the same testimony tonight.
You provided some testimony.
At the first hearing, yes.
Now,
It's also shown in our drainage report maps where the flow goes, so those items are addressed.
paragraph 17 says, the applicant's engineer has provided an explanation in his response letter regarding the runoff on adjoining properties. However, details and calculations to quantify pre-developed and post-developed conditions on properties to the east should be provided. The reviewing person then states the applicant should quantify how much water is running off of the site onto the adjoining properties. Additional details and calculations should verify the impact to the adjoining properties. Now, my first question would be, did you ever provide to the reviewing engineer the things he is seeking here as far as quantifying water onto the site, as well as additional details and calculations verifying the impact to the adjoining properties?
Yes, it's in the stormwater report submitted with the first application. We also provided testimony at the first hearing indicating the quantities of water that flows to the south and to the east.
Well, my only question, Mr. Chairman, would be, then I would like to have the board professional comment as to whether or not he is satisfied that they responded to the criteria referred to in paragraph 17 on page 4. Now, maybe this gentleman is accurate, but it seems to me that either the municipal engineer or planning board engineer missed something, or they didn't provide it to him.
Sure. Mr. Dargy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, the comment that the applicants refer, or the Mr. Gazarovski is referring to is comment number 17 in our letter. And this was of a greater concern when there was a building at that location, because there was a very small strip that of land on the applicant's property that appeared to flow east, and what we were asking is for a quantification of what the existing flow would be and what the proposed flow would be. Just specific to that one area discharging onto the east. It was apparent from observation that the area was smaller, as Mr. Bowler had said in his testimony. The area discharging to that in that direction was smaller, even in the prior iteration of the plan. It's of less concern, or it's not as concerning. In fact, it's not concerning at all with this revision, because the building is no longer there, so that actually creates an area where the property can actually get graded such that there's a swale created on the applicant's property to carry any water that's discharged to that location and keep it on their property and run over land to the stream. So there is a quantification that can get made, and I believe Mr. Bowler, when he says that may be in there, it may be something that needs to be clarified, just highlighted, I guess, more than anything else, as to the actual quantity of that water. So I don't doubt that Mr. Bowler has provided that. We were actually asking for it to just be highlighted and pointed out specifically. And I think that can still be accomplished. But like I said, with this revision, it's not as concerning because the grading has been modified such that the drainage isn't discharging onto the properties to the east.
Well, one problem that I have is that, and I've done this for a long time, and I realize that oftentimes plans, only when, of course, they are approved, the board establishes a set of conditions which must be complied with, and oftentimes those are engineering questions. The problem I have with this is that it was called for in this letter, and if the board moves forward this evening to a final vote, and it in fact approves this plan, how do we ensure that this is complied with, and how could we ensure that our engineer, if we retain one, can review those plans and is satisfied with both the testimony of Mr. Bowler as well as the planning board engineer?
Well, I think the simple solution to that is, prior to us considering any adjudication on this application this evening, I'm going to have Mr. Bowler and Mr. Dargy look at that report. I'm sure you have a copy of it, and you can point it out to Mr. Dargy.
Yes.
All right?
Done this evening?
Yeah. Should take about 5 minutes,
It's
I
also
would think.
demonstrated on the plans that are currently submitted to the township and have been
Take about
reviewed.
5 minutes, so I'm sure they can, I will accept Mr. Bowler's representation, and we'll get confirmation from Mr. Dargy at some point this evening, so. All right, thank you.
I have no further questions of this witness. I do have questions of the next witness. Good evening.
Good evening.
Mr. Howman? Howman?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Would you first identify, and if you can, clarify exactly what your position is with the applicant entity looking to build this project?
The applicant entity is Metro Storage LLC. That is the company that employs me as Vice President of Development.
What do those duties entail?
I manage the team in the development, both for design and construction of these facilities.
Could you speak into the microphone, because I'm soft voice and...
I manage the teams that produce these projects from the point that they are identified as acquisition prospects to the point that they are built.
When you say team, does that mean that there are other individuals who are out looking at these various sites?
Yes.
And then when they locate a site that they think is acceptable, they bring that site to you for further action?
The way it happens in our organization is that we have an acquisition team that I am not part of. So what happens is that acquisition team works for, in this case, many years to determine a viable site, which then gets vetted through the members of the acquisition team and the ownership of the company. Once it gets through to that point, a purchase agreement is made. As part of that purchase agreement, there is time for due diligence, as well as what we're going through now, meaning the approval of a project.
Now, I understand that, and I understand you're speaking in terms of an acquisition team. How many people are members of this acquisition team?
8-ish.
Now, this acquisition team operates throughout the entire United States?
No, only in the areas that we have markets that we are developing.
What do you identify as the market area that this particular project is located in?
New Jersey and New York.
Okay. So would it be the entire 8-member team who looks at this possible site, or is it just simply several members of the acquisition?
At some point during the process of vetting a property, the entire team looks at the property.
Now, were you a part of that vetting process?
No, I just told you I wasn't part of that process.
Sorry?
I explained I am not part of the acquisition team.
Okay, so with regard to where this property is located and what the existing zoning is in the municipality, what the ordinances are in the municipality, you are not a part of the team that determines that.
I am part of the team that once the site is identified and under contract, I take it from there and assemble our team to attend to those issues.
That's not my question. For example, in this particular case, the use which you are seeking on this property is not a permitted use, and thus it requires a use variance. You would not be a part of determining that a use variance was necessary before they went into the contract stage.
Correct.
So my question is then, and I understand when someone is speaking in terms of being in charge of development, and quite frankly, when I hear that, I'm assuming that the witness coming forward is fully familiar with locating the site, determining what the zoning is, determining whether variances would be needed, but you are not a part of that.
I don't understand what you're questioning.
The question, I think, is pretty simple. Maybe it's not as simple as I think it is, which I understand. But my idea of a person who is in charge of development, it is that person who looks and finds a site and makes a determination whether, not just that it is suitable as far as people will come to place storage there, but it is suitable because it is located in a zone which the municipality deems to be suitable for the development of a warehouse. You are not a part of that process.
Not in my organization, no. And it's similar in other storage companies. This is the way most of them are set up.
I care how other storage companies.
I'm just saying it's standard practice. So.
I care about this
That's
application right here, and you are present giving testimony this evening.
I am.
Talking about the suitability of this particular location.
Excuse me, excuse me. Whoa. I'm talking. I get to talk, all right? All right. Mr. Gazarovski, I don't believe Mr. Hallman has been proffered as an expert witness. Has he been proffered as an expert witness?
That's correct.
He is, well, let me finish. It's my microphone right now, okay? The only expert witnesses who have testified in these proceedings are the engineer, traffic engineer, and the planner. I don't think he's ever been proffered as an expert. So for you to question him on site suitability, that's really testimony that I believe was elicited from the professional planner. Now, if you have any questions of this witness pertaining to any of his testimony that he's provided this evening or at any other time, Mr. Gazarovski, that's fine. But I think you're going down the line of considering him to be an expert witness, which I don't think he's been offered. And by the way, that will be a determination in terms of credibility and whether or not he even is required to give expert testimony for this board to make.
I don't think my questioning went into his testifying as an expert. He is a employee of the applicant company.
Correct.
And he has testified that he is the person who is, I believe, in charge of development of new sites.
Well, I think his testimony this evening was limited to a comparison using business record exceptions to the hearsay rule to another site on Route 22. That's what his testimony was this evening. Now, certainly you can cross-examine him as to any of those issues, and I'll even give you the latitude of even cross-examining him again on anything that he may have testified in prior hearings.
Which was the first night, I believe.
Okay.
First night of testimony.
Having said that, in recognizing that it's the acquisition team that has the initial responsibility of selecting a site, are you the person who ultimately has to pass on that site?
If you mean by pass, that
No, what do you mean by pass?
What do you mean by pass?
I didn't use the word pass.
Yes,
Let's use the word approve, okay?
No. I do not approve the sites.
Pardon me?
I do not approve locations that they then take to purchase agreements.
So, in other words, before this property is acquired, you really did absolutely nothing with regard to the inspection of the property, the location,
Well,
the municipality?
The property has not been acquired, just for the record. This is a contract purchase.
All right, a contract signed to acquire the property. I mean, were you a part, did you in any way take part in looking at this site, examining the zoning, reviewing the plans, becoming knowledgeable as to all the variances were necessary before you approved the contract acquisition of this property coming before this board?
Well, I believe that his testimony is he did not have the approval authority.
Again, as I said earlier, I get involved once the purchase contract is signed. Then I get involved.
But basically, as far as the contract being signed, you had absolutely no knowledge or input as to the location of the site until the contract was signed.
Correct.
So your testimony this evening, you identify yourself the person in charge of development. None of that comes into play until after the contract is signed.
Correct, because acquisition is prior to contract signing.
Now, with regard to the example you gave, now, was this an example from one site?
Yes, Springfield, New Jersey.
Okay. And what is the address?
22 U.S. Route 22 West.
Were you involved with that project when it was first acquired?
After the purchase contract was signed, yes.
Now, do you visit these sites from time to time?
Frequently, during approval processes, due diligence processes, construction processes, yes.
How about operation process?
Yes.
How often?
Usually when I'm out in the area, like I am at this point, I'll stop by several facilities. Probably we have 140 stores. I don't get to all of them in a year, but I'd say in this marketplacing that this is a development area for us, I'm out here probably at least once a month.
In this area here?
New Jersey and New York.
Now, how often would you visit this particular site that you gave us as a comparable, for lack of a better word?
Recently or in total?
In the course of a year.
Seeing that I've been in this marketplace and I also manage some of the maintenance on this property, I've probably been to this facility in the last year probably 6 to 8 times.
Now, how long period of time would you spend at the site when you were there?
Probably 3 to 4 hours.
Okay. Now, did you ever personally conduct any of the studies or counts which you are referring to?
No, it comes from our system.
What comes to your computer system?
Yes.
Well, do you ever plug into that system the numbers that are being put forth today by you?
It's put in, it's produced by the customer actually putting in their PIN code into the access system to gain access to the building.
Then it goes into some computer up in the sky someplace that then comes out with these figures that you have?
Well, I believe it's a server on site, and then it's fed back to our secure server at our home office on a daily basis.
How did you get this document?
This document was requested of our district manager, Travis Bassey, who lives in New Jersey. He is the manager of this and I believe 9 other facilities in the market. I said I need a week in December of gate information. He then produced this information from the system and emailed it to me.
Now, did you make a determination that it was important to secure this information in order to give testimony here this evening?
I requested information so I could understand the traffic on this facility, seeing that it was comparable to the facility we're proposing.
Now, you realize also, do you not, that there are in fact traffic consultants who could actually go out to the site and take the counts?
Sure.
Chose not to do that.
I chose not to do that because they would monitor traffic typically on a roadway and not into the building.
Why wouldn't they monitor traffic into the building?
Because they monitor roadway traffic with the things that go across the road. That's how they monitor traffic and/or count individual cars coming in.
They couldn't count individual cars coming onto the site to get into the facility?
I assume they could.
What?
I assume they could.
But you chose not to do that.
We chose not to do it. That's correct.
That's correct.
Well, Mr. Sachs, you know, I'm aware of the hearsay rule and aware of exceptions to the hearsay rule. This can be, I think, categorized as a business record.
Absolutely.
But it's not being offered for that. It's being offered as to the truthfulness of the counts. He didn't.
Whoa. You want to talk about an interpretation of the hearsay rule. If it's an exception to the hearsay rule, it's being offered for the truth of the matter asserted. Am I correct, Mr. Gazarovski? I mean, I haven't been in law school in 37 years, but that's my recollection of what hearsay.
Over 50.
Right, exactly. All right. But the exception to the hearsay rule permits hearsay to come in. And there are several, listen, if you want me to go on for the next 20 minutes on the exceptions to the hearsay rule, I'll be glad to, but we know that business records are one, official records are another, dying declarations against interests, adoptive admissions,
I would acknowledge that this was a record kept in the course of business in that facility, and as a business record, it can be entered into for the purpose of it being record. I would object to it being entered into for the purpose of, as to the authenticity or the truthfulness of the numbers that are produced. That's my objection. I'll leave it.
Well, I'll ask you a question. Is it your position then that if something falls within the exception to the hearsay rule, it cannot be admitted as evidence?
There are certain exceptions to the hearsay rule,
Right.
such as the unavailability of the person who did it, plus the fact that it can't be an exception if there's a way of performing that same task with a person standing there and doing it, and then having that person come in to testify.
Mr. Gazarovski, wouldn't you admit, with your knowledge of the rules of evidence in the state of New Jersey, that the reason we have exceptions to the hearsay rule is to permit business records to come in without requiring the individual to testify to that? In other words, as long as the record is kept in the ordinary course of business, it can be introduced for the truth of the matter asserted. That's what the exception to the hearsay rule indicates.
I respectfully disagree with you.
Well, all right.
I respect your opinion.
Okay.
On top of which, he had nothing at all to do with the production of that particular document, or rather he got it from the operator who was not here tonight.
Well, I think
That's my objection.
Okay, but I think his testimony, and again, I'm not going to, he can speak for himself, but the reason I asked him if it's a record that's kept in the ordinary course of business, then this is something, Mr. Hallman, that's generated on a daily basis?
Yes.
And you have access to it on a daily basis, do you not?
Yes.
And in fact, that's how you were able to print it out, I assume, right?
Yes.
Okay. Mr.
Just so I'm clear, I'm sorry, Mr.
Yeah.
Sines. Just so I'm clear, you don't have an individual operator there. You were speaking to your on-site manager having provided, he's an employee of the company as well.
Correct.
It's not any independent contractor, agency. All of your facilities are owned, managed, operated by
Correct.
Metro.
Correct.
Thank
Yeah, but you know what, going one step further, we have no idea, for example, of the number of other facilities similar to this are located in and around the project that he's referring to. And that's why, again, make my objection, but let's proceed.
Well, I'm curious, what do you mean by other facilities? Talking about other Metro storage facilities, or?
Similar type facilities. I mean, for example, in this municipality, this location, there may be X number of similar facilities located around this particular site. We don't know how many other facilities similar to this are located in and around the site that is referred to, which may affect the amount of business that it does.
Okay, in other words, other operators of other similar types of facilities. All right, well, certainly, if Mr. Hallman wants to testify to that, he certainly can. Or you can ask him.
If he knows.
Yeah.
Are you aware of it?
What is the question?
I think the question was, are there any other similar type facilities not owned by Metro Storage in the proximity of where this location is on Route 22 in Springfield?
Yes, there are probably 3 to 4 that I can think of.
Okay.
In that immediate vicinity. Can I add one more thing? I do a lot of this. I see a lot of these records. I deal with a lot of trip generation as in my position. These numbers are fairly reflective of stores of this size and type within our 140-store portfolio. I don't see this as being lower or higher within a few percentage points than other facilities we operate. So it is fairly reflective of what our facilities generate.
And Bob, this is also, and you said it earlier, but this is a fully stabilized building relative from an occupancy perspective.
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Gazarovski, you're a witness.
140 stores in this immediate area throughout Jersey and New York?
16 states.
I didn't think there were 140 in New Jersey.
No.
How many are there in New Jersey?
I think we're in various stages of development, but I believe 12.
Okay.
Okay, you have any other person you want to call?
I have witnesses.
I'm just saying, was there anybody else you wanted to cross-examine this evening?
There's no further, I mean, I did my cross-examination the last time.
Yeah, I mean, there's no, Mr. Wisacala, no other witnesses?
No other witnesses
All
at
right.
this time.
That's why I'm asking if he wants to
Okay.
talk to anybody else.
I don't want to go down this road with Mr. Wisacala yet. He says, we have no other witnesses we want to call at this time. So you have any other witnesses he wants to call this evening? So we don't go down the same rabbit hole we went down.
Calling any other
the last
witnesses?
time we were here.
I'm not calling any other witnesses. Of course, if there's anything I would need to call a witness up to rebut, if there was a statement or something, that would be the caveat. But I told Mr. Gazarovski the other day, for the same reason, when I called him, I would not, would have my planner and my traffic engineer here, but did not expect to call them again.
Okay.
Unless necessary to rebut whatever witness testimony he may have. Mr. Gazarovski did not advise me of his witnesses for this evening either, for that matter.
All right. And then if that is the case, if you do put rebuttal on, then Mr. Gazarovski would have the opportunity to cross-examine that witness.
Try to avoid that.
Fine. Okay, thank you.
Possible.
Your case, Mr. Gazarovski.
Take a brief comfort break.
Sure. That's a good idea. I think we'll give the stenographer a break. We stand at recess 5 minutes. All right, we'll go back on the record. We'll call the meeting back to order. Ms. Silverman, could we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Dewhurst?
Here.
Ms. Chevalier? Here. Mr. Connor?
Here.
Ms. Kilbo?
Here.
Wagner?
Here.
Mr. Walker?
Here.
Mrs. Sankowski?
Here.
Mrs. Stoner?
Present.
Chairman Sullivan?
Here.
Mr. Sachs?
Here.
Mr. Wong? Here. Mr. Hart? Here. Mr. LaValla?
Here.
Mr. Sargent?
Present.
All right, well, last we left, we were on 15-19C Metro Storage LLC. Mr. Gazarovski's, as the objector's case, is going to continue. Sir?
Chairman, when I looked at my notes, I've neglected to ask Mr. Hamel a couple of questions. I'd like the courtesy of asking him so.
Right, but we can bring him back. Mr. Hallman, you got to come back up.
Obviously, all witnesses are still under oath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Harmon, what is the address now of the facility in Springfield?
22 US Route 22 West.
Now, do you know or are you aware of whether or not that located facility at that place in Springfield is in a zone which is a permitted use in Springfield?
It was 5 years ago. It is now. We went through an approval process, so I can't recall the details of exactly how or what got approved, but obviously it is because we're operating.
Do you know how many parking, what are the number of storage spaces in that facility?
Units? 774 rental units, 774 rental units for a,
774?
yes.
Just move that microphone away from you slightly, you get a feedback. Thanks.
Do you know how many stories that facility has?
2. It was an existing building that we converted.
So it's 2 stories.
Yes.
Thank you. We'll continue, Mr. Gazarovski.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Wichiscala, you still with us here?
Yep. Oh, I think you checked.
When I came in this evening, I was given by my client a series of photographs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, which basically reflect the residential structures surrounding this project, and there's the identifying address of them. And rather than call a series of witnesses to identify each of the houses, I'd like if the board could take notice of them and they could get them marked.
Why don't we have Mr. Sachs take a look first before the board looks at them, because I don't know what they are or who took them.
Do you have any objection, John? What?
No objection.
Okay.
I'll let Mr. Sachs
While Mr. Sachs is reviewing, I do want to let the public know that there is going to be a public portion, as there will be at every hearing in front of the zoning board of any matter. So please don't run out. Our scheduled time is 10:30 to end. The public this evening, I guarantee you.
Let's give one to Kim.
Go
Okay.
ahead, sir, I'm sorry.
All right, Mr. Gazarovski, I don't have any objection to these photographs coming in without without authentication, so to speak. I'm sure the board can take judicial notice that these are photographs of various residences adjacent to this property in various condition. And
1A and
yeah.
1B.
So it's, I'm sorry, it was two, there's 2 of them, yeah, okay. All right, so we'll leave this one for the board, and when you would like to refer to it, we'll pass it down. Okay.
So what are we marking?
01A and B, which,
Do we have a name?
we'll call them,
The one with environmental on it?
we'll call them objectors' photographs of adjacent properties. Okay. Okay. I will leave it here for now.
Yeah, I would call that as my witness, Brett Crossan.
Mr. Mr. Crossan, please raise your right hand. Swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
And state your name, professional affiliation for the record.
Brooke Crossan, Crossan, and I'm a consulting professional engineer.
Good to see you, Mr. Crossan.
You as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Crossan, are you self-employed by your own company, or are you part of an engineering firm?
I am self-employed.
Okay. Are you a licensed professional engineer in the state of New Jersey?
I am and have been for the past 45 years.
Closer. And are you also a licensed planner in the state of New Jersey?
I am.
Just give us a brief overview of your educational background, starting with after you graduated from high school.
I have a bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering and a PhD in geophysical fluid dynamics from Rutgers University. And have been practicing in the state since 1975, and am currently also an adjunct professor at New Jersey Institute of Technology, teaching an environmental course with respect to stormwater management, climate change, and ethics.
Okay, now, Mr. Crossan, prior to coming here this evening, did you have occasion to visit the site?
I did. Well,
Before you do that, Ms. Gray, are you offering Mr. Crossan as an expert in engineering? Okay, that's fine. Okay, that's fine. And Mr. Chairman, I'm familiar with Mr. Crossan as well.
The board recognizes his expertise.
The question was, prior to coming here this evening, did you have the opportunity to familiarize yourself with the site?
Yes, I have. Reviewing of various aerial photographs, the plans, and walking the perimeter of the site.
Okay. When you walked the perimeter of the site, did that also include that area to the rear of the site where the residential homes are located?
It included some of the homes.
Okay.
Not the homes that are the subject of these pictures.
Okay. Prior to coming here this evening, did you have occasion to review these photographs?
I did, and spoke to folks that had taken the pictures and the occasion on which they had taken them.
Okay. Now, these series of photographs identified by address as well as by lot, they do reflect a situation of standing water on the rear of those properties, correct?
Yes.
Now, looking at those photographs, looking at those physical conditions, can you relate that to the engineering studies and observations that you made with regard to the stormwater plans of runoff and whatnot as concerns the application in question? You understand that question?
Yes.
Still convoluted.
Yes, but first, I should indicate that the focus of the drainage concerns and these pictures are not the 4 lots that are immediately to the east of the building. Rather, they are the lots that are to the east of the wetlands and the flood hazard area and the stream that to which the discharge is going to be occurring. And it's in those low areas where there are these flooding issues, where water is ponding on the property and then is extending back onto the adjacent residential properties.
Okay. Now, at present, the site in question is unoccupied. In other words, it's vacant. There is no structure present upon the property itself. It's made up simply of open land as well as a semi-forested area.
That's correct.
And if one were to then construct a building in the amount of square footage as well as the parking, that would create an area of impervious surface, would it not?
That is correct.
Now, if impervious surface were located in that square footage, would that not in fact exacerbate some of the conditions which are presently shown without that building being there.
Yes, but that deserves an explanation.
Okay.
And to start with the explanation, we need to go back to the stormwater management report and the existing conditions. And I believe that their calculations used a runoff coefficient for the site that is too high, and so that they were, in their calculations, were starting with a very high existing runoff, higher than currently exists.
Explain what runoff coefficient means.
It's the amount of runoff that, when it rains, a certain percentage infiltrates into the soil, a certain amount runs off the site, and eventually to a stream, and part of it wets the vegetation that's on the site.
Okay, now, you indicated that you believe that the coefficient of runoff at present is stated by a number by them that it is higher than is actually there.
That's correct.
What does that mean with regard to the review of this plan and the impact it has upon proposed runoff?
Well, the state requires certain reductions for the 2-year run, for the 2-year storm, the 10-year storm, the 100-year storm. And if you start with an artificially high number, even when you do the reductions that the state requires you to do, you're coming up with a higher value in the proposed than you should if you had started with a lower number to begin with.
Just in layman's, and I think I understand that, but in layman's term, let's assume that the existing number is in fact 7, and they use the figure of 9 rather than 7. Well, that would mean even if they maintain what was presently there as 7, they would show a reduction of 2, when in fact that would be a fallacy, would it not?
Yes.
Could you just explain that to the board in layman's terms?
Okay, so...
I'm surprised they could figure it out, but just try to lay it out.
Let's view it as 100. And let's say the existing runoff, using their runoff coefficient, we'll say is 77. And then the reduction that is required for the peak runoff brings it down in the future, say, to 60. But if in reality the existing runoff is 50 instead of 77, they should, instead of bringing it down to 50, they should be bringing it down to 40. So that if you don't start with the right existing conditions, you can permit yourself to have a higher peak runoff in the build situation.
Okay. Now, before I proceed forward, the hope of having some clarity, would there be any members of the board that would like a little further explanation of that rather than wait to the end?
No one's raised their hand, I'm assuming not.
So
far, we're with the math.
Okay.
What is the net result of what happens if that occurs?
Well, the net result is that the peak runoff in the future is greater than it should be, and also there are other factors relating to the total volume of runoff and what the impact there is, and that's kind of a separate story. But the other part of the existing conditions are that they've made the assertion that there is zero infiltration that is currently occurring on the site, which does not seem to be a reasonable starting place, because, again, the state has requirements with respect to infiltration, and they are required,
This is what you want?
no, they are required to either ensure that 100% of the site's average annual pre-developed groundwater recharge be maintained after development, or that 100% of the difference between the site's pre- and post-development two-year runoff volumes be infiltrated. So what the engineer has done is say that the current infiltration is zero, so that the future infiltration can also be zero. So, in other words, everything that's landing on all of the roofs and parking is going to be run off into the stream. It's not, none of it will be infiltrated, so that the the total volume going into that stream and the wetlands is going to increase. And the reason that that's important is that, well, let me go to the flood hazard area determination. There were two methods that were available to them according to the state rules. One is to assume a 1 foot flow over top of the low point of the roadway. You can look, you have to look a mile downstream, but it turns out that Route 9 is your impediment. So they established a flood hazard area based upon a 1 foot flow of water over top of Route 9. Unfortunately, I think they picked the wrong elevation. They picked a gutter on Cindy Lane rather than a higher elevation on Route 9. So I've already corresponded with DEP to alert them to that, because I think that they've artificially narrowed their flood hazard area, and that some of their grading may be in that flood hazard area. But in any event, so what they have done is avoided any modeling of that stream, any modeling of the capacity of the culvert under Route 9, in order to simplify things. But by doing that, they have no information whatsoever about what real heights are of the floodwaters in a 2-year storm. Can a 2-year storm pass the culvert in Route 9? We don't know. There's been no information submitted. Does a 10-year storm pass through there? At what point does water start backing up into the wetlands and then backing up into the adjacent properties? And we have photographs from a storm that, according to records, I checked the rainfall records for the particular storm that was involved there, and that was a trying to recall now. It was the equivalent. It was less than a water quality storm. The 1.25 inches in a 2-hour period. It was, I think, 1.2 inches, and by my notes that day, the storm lasted about 3 hours. So that type of storm created the flooding on these back properties. And so I think that the applicant really needs to do the detailed modeling, determine the flood hazard area by method 6 instead of method 5,
and do HEC-RAS modeling where they do cross-sections in the stream out there and evaluate the capacity of Route 9. And that's the only way that realistically they could answer the question, what is the flooding that is occurring out here and could be occurring on the basis of their development? Because currently the bulk of the site drains into the Cindy Lane jug handle and makes its way into the detention basin there, and then from the detention basin is discharged directly into the culvert under Route 9. And so they are now providing detention on their site, but they are then changing the point of discharge into the wetlands and upstream of Route 9, much closer to the residents that are experiencing these flooding issues. So I think that for a variety of reasons, there are legitimate concerns here that should be in order when you're looking at the positive and negative balancing, that they need to be more specific about the potential for these negative impacts.
When you say negative impact, do you mean additional flooding onto the adjacent properties?
Yes.
Is it, from an engineering perspective, is it possible that after this project is constructed, it will remedy the flooding onto the adjacent property?
Well, it hasn't been designed currently to remedy. I suppose it could be possible to alter the design to further mitigate.
But not this design.
Not this design.
Let's talk about wetlands and the significance it has to this application.
Well, this application is dependent upon the wetlands on site being isolated and therefore being eligible for a general permit to fill the wetlands and to eliminate the buffer associated with that. However, based upon my observations, there is an area along the Cindy Lane jug handle where there is concentrated flow that comes over the embankment from the wetlands down into the Cindy Lane right-of-way. Some of the flow, there is an area that DOT has placed riprap along the curb of Cindy Lane that carries some water to an inlet, and some water flows over the curb and into the actual cartway of Cindy Lane jug handle, and then flows by curb and gutter flow into inlets and makes its way into the drainage detention basin, et cetera. So based upon my experience with DEP and wetlands, we don't believe that the wetlands are isolated and that they should be entitled to that permit. And we've been in dialogue with DEP about that and are going to be having a meeting with DEP on that point.
But the jurisdiction as to that decision rests with the DEP, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, fine. So regardless of what this board were to do, it would still have to be reviewed by the DEP, and if they find negatively with regard to that, that would impact these approvals.
Right. Well, there's two aspects. There's a flood hazard permit with DEP, and then there's the wetlands general permit with DEP. So if DEP were to agree with us that the wetlands are not isolated, the general permit goes away, and that there's no hope of salvaging anything close to this design if you can't fill the wetlands and clear the wetlands buffer. If they agree with some of our points with respect to the flood hazard area, they could still have the applicant do additional design and submit additional materials in order to potentially get an approvable permit.
I think you touched briefly on this, but can you once again just hit with a couple of bullet points the situation with regard to stormwater as far as existing conditions and proposed conditions? Or did you hit that already?
Well, I can certainly review. I mean, again, it goes back to, I think, the existing conditions with respect to the amount of runoff and the amount of infiltration have been, are incorrect, and by starting with those incorrect numbers, they've kind of skewed what they're doing in the future. But then over and above that problem is the whole issue of we don't know what kind of storm events will cause flooding in the wetlands and will cause flooding on the neighbors' properties. And there's nothing in the stormwater management report that I reviewed, and there's nothing in the testimony of the transcripts that I've reviewed other than just very bland statements that, to me, have not been supported by calculations.
Now, there are certain aspects of dealing with this water that are within the jurisdiction of a DEP, correct?
Yes.
But there's other aspects of dealing with the on-site conditions that are within the purview of this board.
That's correct.
Would you outline those conditions that are within the purview of this board?
Well, as far as the exact design of how things are going on in the site, that is certainly controlled initially by the board, but the ultimate result of the design has to be acceptable to DEP.
Now, you also indicated that you are in fact a licensed planner.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you're aware of the fact, are you not, that this particular application requires a use variance?
I am. Actually, before we get into the planning aspects, there's one more what I view as an important element with respect to the engineering. That some of this is, and this, again, I've also passed on to NJDEP, but the American Society of Civil Engineers has, for several years, had a policy statement on the impact of climate change. And this is a direct quote. There is a growing need for engineers to incorporate future climate change into project design criteria. Unfortunately, current practices and rules governing such approaches do not adequately address concerns associated with climate change. Current engineering design standards, codes, regulations, and associated laws that govern infrastructure are generally not structured to allow design adaptation to address climate change. But in the case of a use variance before the Board of Adjustment, you have more discretion in that regard. For example, I also do some noise consulting and have taken the noise training courses at Rutgers that all of the noise enforcement people throughout the state have to take in order to testify in court about violations. And the guidance there is quite clear that if a project has no variances, compliance with the numbers in the state noise code or those noise codes that have been approved by the state is all that the board can require. But if there are variances and noise is a particular concern, the board has the flexibility to be more stringent with respect to noise if variances are required. And examples were given where that has stood up in court, so that the board has the ability to be more stringent with respect to stormwater concerns if they so choose. And just to continue, that from an engineering perspective, the first fundamental principle is engineers uphold and advance the integrity, honor, and dignity of the engineering profession by, one, using their knowledge and skill for the enhancement of human welfare and the environment. The first fundamental canon, engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public and shall strive to comply with the principles of sustainable development in the performance of their professional duties. So, obviously, there are other things that are in the ethical statements that the ASCE has, but the point is that the engineer's first responsibility is to the public health and welfare. It's not to their client. It's to the public health and welfare. Just as a little bit of background. But then,
Having said that, it's in your belief that applying that to this particular case, the applicant's engineer, although employed by the applicant, also has a professional responsibility to ensure that the surrounding property owners are not impacted by flooding conditions.
he does, but obviously everybody has their own interpretation of what level of detail is required for them in that regard. But further, on January 27th, so just a few days ago, Executive Order 100, issued by Governor Murphy, acknowledges that climate change is causing, quote, an increase in the frequency and intensity of severe weather events, end quote, and will, quote, result in increases of intensity of rainfall. And he's directed that by February 26th, DEP shall identify which land use permitting and stormwater permitting programs, and other programs too, but those are the ones that relate to us because land use permitting is wetlands and stormwater permitting is clear.